Hi, and welcome into a talk that I know a number of you have asked about a couple times. So I thought I'd build this about going and talking about all of these energy systems we've gone and hit in our talks before now, and how does it tie into training, and what does it all mean? Before I dive into this thing, be aware of a few things. First of all, this is a field where I can go do a PhD in just this field, right? So I'm going to give you like the snowflake on the top of like a glacier view so that you have a basic understanding of how all these things like glycolysis and creatine phosphate kind of fit in with these training zones that we do and how we use them. So this is very basic. I can go and point you towards a lot of stuff to read to help enhance this work, but let's go and keep this as short as possible. With that said, this is going to be a bit of a longer talk, so if you need a break, take a break. Final thing is this work is mainly pulled from Joe Friel's work and from Allen and Coggin's book. But I will go and say this. Almost everybody who you see who works in this field, especially folks who are in physiology and all that stuff, basically the zones are all the same because we're all humans, which means our bodies kind of work in the same way. All right, let's explain a few things here before we dive in. Zones. These are just basic zones that we go and break down based on the physiology and the changes in it that are occurring in these intensity regions. LT2HR, percent of lactate threshold, 0.2 heart rate. This is a way that I can go and judge which zone I'm in, but I need to have a lactate threshold test ideally, or a FTP field test to go and judge or to go and set all these things up. I cannot do it just purely off of a age predicted max HR. All right, so if you want to take the time and do that, talk to a coach because we can help go and point you towards the right way of doing this and help you judge if this is a thing you should do. RPE, rating a perceived exertion. We will use here what's called the 0 to 10 modified Borg scale. 0 is like I'm in a chair doing nothing. 10 is like I have nothing else left. I am maxed out. So we'll go and talk about what each of these zones feels like as we go through them. TT, this is not a race. This is the talk test. This is a product of Dr. Carl Foster, was one of the minds behind this. And basically what it is it's going to use speech patterns and how hard it feels like how hard it feels like to talk to help you kind of, in a very broad scope, judge which zones you're in. This is very, very well supported in everybody, beginners, elites, cardiac patients, pulmonary patients, everybody, right? This works very well because our breathing is heavily driven off of what's happening in the cells themselves and their demand for oxygen. All right, let's go and talk through our zones here. Zone 1, this is my active recovery zone. If I go and look, heart rate is low. RPE is very low. This is very, 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 very easy to very easy. The way I always go and speak about this zone is the point of it is to increase blood flow without creating undue stress. So imagine I'm going to go and ride my town bike around town with a 5-year-old. All right, we're going on flat land. We're not going on like, a mountain bike ride, and we're going to ride really easy. And the purpose of this is, again, it's going to help your recovery. Our talk test is what we call a positive here. And in fact, I shouldn't do that because that could be deceiving. So it's a positive test, which means that if I use 15 seconds of speech, like for example, what we use in research is the pledge. So I pledge allegiance to the flag, da, 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 all that stuff. If I can say it in a normal speaking volume, tone, and rate, and I would go and say that was easy to say immediately, then I'm a positive. That's a good thing. All right. So for this first zone, we should be able to have an in-depth conversation about something where I'm not, having to stop my speech to be able to breathe. If we go and think of these two right here as bars, this is mainly aerobic. In fact, why don't I change colors, make this colorful? This is mainly aerobic, but out of our, 100%, we're not really doing that much. Anaerobic is still there. It's always there. We never turn it off. So both of these are always going and working at the exact same time. So zone 2, we're moving up a bit here. And in fact, we're going to move here to, whoa, wrong color, easy, RPE. And we could say that this is trending slightly towards the moderate, but really this is easy to maybe a little bit harder. This is a pace that I'll go for my long endurance zone. Our talk test is still, again, a positive, which means that I am going to I'm going to be able to talk easily. I can go and carry on, a lengthy conversation with the person beside me. The purpose of this zone is basically, these are our long rides, our endurance rides, our go out there and ride for 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours rides. Our goal here is a number of things. The first one is it's going to really focus on utilizing fat, which you should know by now where that fat is being used. Being able to use fat more efficiently. It's going to help us go and focus on shifting our fibers to be a little bit more aerobically focused, because this is a very aerobic zone. So if I do a little of drawing here, I could say that my aerobic engine is being used a bit more. My anaerobic is still at that like super low threshold. It's not really being called into place, maybe at the beginning, but it's mostly focused on aerobic work, because I should be going and spending 95% plus of my time if I do a long endurance ride in this zone 2. As a part of this too, because again, I am applying stress to the aerobic group primarily, I'm going to see some minor gains in increasing blood flow to the working groups. All right, zone 3. This is what could be called a number of things. Runners like the phrase tempo. I like the phrase medium endurance. Regardless, this is a pace that we actually see research-wise tends to get used a decent amount in racing, especially road, where we're going out there for a longer race. We're getting into kind of 3 to 4, so we're easy approaching kind of moderate, right? So this is where we begin to kind of have a little bit of a skewing of the talk test, where we get what we call a plus minus stage, which means that I can still talk, but if I were to go and ask you, is it comfortable to talk? It's not an immediate yes. It's kind of, well, yeah, I guess so. Or, I mean, I can talk, but it's not as easy as it was, right? So it's getting a little bit harder to actually talk, where I notice a difference because my breathing rate has gone up. This is a zone where, again, I can go a long time in it. I can do an hour to, maybe 3 hours if I'm really, really fit as a pro. But we're beginning to get into that last kind of stage where aerobic is just the main force here. So aerobic, again, let's go and fill up our gauge some more here. Aerobic is still a primary force here, but we do start to see a little bit more shift here in anaerobic work. Not major, again, but some additional work, and part of that is because this is a higher zone, so I'll probably see a little bit more variance in how hard I push my pedals, which means every time I have a spike, I'm going to hit more of that non-aerobic until my aerobic can catch up. So for this particular zone, this one really starts to go and push a lot of the aerobic changes. So recall that, glycogen thing, the storage form of a carbohydrate in our muscles. We're going to start to go and build up more of a store when we recover from a ride like this. We're going to go and push that aerobic capacity more. So we're becoming still a little bit more efficient at going and using fats, but we're starting to shift away from those towards more carbohydrates because carbohydrates are more efficient. So hopefully that goes and makes sense to you. On top of that, you'll see that we're beginning to approach the peak. So zone 2 and zone 3, and really into zone 4, which I'll go and talk about in a second, of cardiac changes. So I increase my volume of my blood in terms of going and adding in more plasma, or basically more water for us. I'm going to start to increase potentially the size of the heart a bit. And that's a good thing for us. It's not heart failure. It's a necessary part of adapting to endurance work. All right, zone 4. This is kind of our threshold zone. This is right at that lactate threshold point, and we're going to begin to get hard here. So we're going to get moderate to moderately hard here. So this is going to really begin to feel like a workout, and these are where we begin to have drills, right? Or really drills where we'll go on and then rest, and then on and then rest. Our talk test here still is generally in a plus minus state, because while I can still probably talk okay, it's not going to be a comfortable form, but I'm not in a full-on failure mode yet. So I can probably say the pledge. It's just not very much fun, right? Aerobic wise, we're getting really close here to starting to max out this one. In fact, depending on who I am, I could be within 80 to 90% or 80 to 95, depending on who I am and where I'm actually at, to being at maximal aerobic ability. A part of that also means that we start to see more anaerobic ATP being produced. So this right here is a point is where we start to kind of feel that, lactate buildup. And really it's not the lactate, recall it's the hydrogen ions that drop my pH, right? So I'm going to begin to build up a bunch of these byproducts here. And in fact, this is kind of a critical point, because once I go over it, I'm going to start to build up this stuff very, very fast. Because we have a zone here where we're going to be putting a ton of stress on the aerobic groups, we're taking what we did before and maxing it out. So basically we're going to get a lot of new blood flow. We're going to get a lot of new volume in our bloodstream. We'll get a lot of work on going and converting this lactate aerobically, so with O2, into a fuel source. And if you recall, a lot of that is occurring within the aerobic fibers and the heart. So we have a lot going on here, and these are where I'd say the drills start to kind of hurt, and they start to kind of not be the most fun thing. I do include, following the example of a very noted coach, Max Testa. I do include this 4C zone. I believe Joe Friel also includes this, which is the climbing zone. We know when you begin to climb a hill that's moderately steep to steep, we kind of shift our body forward, and we begin to apply force in a different way than we do on flat ground, which means that we need to add a little bit in terms of the heart rate, because I generally tend to use more of my core, more of my arms, which tends to spike up my rate that I'm at. So adding 5 to 10 beats roughly, and this is where you have to work with a person who knows what they're doing. But the intensity is about the same. And again, our talk test is I can still say the pledge. It's not really that comfortable. So I can say it fully, but it's not that much fun. But I'm not at like a no, I hate this phase. Again, I could just go and copy this over because if I'm in the right zone, it should be just about the same here. So we'll say the same thing. Okay, zone 5. This is where we're getting into really high intensity work, and it's really the last zone where a heart rate might be helpful. This is doing what we would call like a VO2 max work or maximal aerobic capacity drills. This is 106 or higher. So this is basically above our breaking point here. We're going and getting into the hard to very hard RPEs. Our talk test is a hard no, which means when I try to go and say the pledge, I either have to take tons of breaks in terms of my speech pattern. So it's I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States, or I just can't do it, right? So it's not a comfortable thing to do at all, period. So that's like our third zone in our talk test. Aerobic engine at this point is maxed out, or it should be pretty close, because again, VO2 max means maximal aerobic capacity. Here's where we start to really begin to lean on this anaerobic work heavily. These drills can be kind of long. They could be 2 to 3 in length is kind of what I've seen a lot of folks do. I could extend that even further if I have the ability to, and if I'm fit enough. A lot of the things we're doing here is really focused on that maximal O2 need and maxing out this aerobic side. So we're going to really go and push. The heart is really going to get a good workout out from this. It's going to get a lot of expansion in its size. We still do have all of those effects like going and increasing our glycogen storage and all of that fun stuff. But again, down here, we're going and leaning more heavily on a glucose or a carbohydrate because it's efficient on the aerobic side, and on the opposing side, I only can burn a carbohydrate without O2. Zone 6, here's what's fun. Heart rate, nothing. These are both like max out for the entire length. Zone 6 is going to be what we call supra O2 max, or above our aerobic maximal. This is really one where we could say that we're trying to focus on anaerobic maximal capacity. So these are going to be, you know, somewhere from 30 seconds to maybe 3 minutes in length, but these are really kind of almost flat out for that entire time, as hard as I can go. And part of our goal is, again, this is like very hard to very, very hard. Our goal here is we're going to mainly focus on this non-aerobic side. So a big part of this is we're going to increase our ability to deal with lactate. So that's not only, it's not as much the clearance of it, because that's again more of zone 4 and a little bit of zone 5, but more of the ability to deal with this and this. All right. So if I'm involved in a sport where I get a lot of, like, you know, sprinting, which is like longer length, so a minute or 2 minutes or 3 minutes, this work will help me deal with the buildup of these byproducts, including a bunch of, you know, opposing ones that we haven't gone and hit. So I can keep going for a little bit longer. That's a big key here. We're also going to start to increase this, we call creatine phosphate and ATP that we store. We'll start to go and increase that quite a bit. And we do start to see a little bit of ability to increase my power, but not as much as our final zone. Okay, final zone. This is flat out sprinting, all right? This is really one that the focus is not on any of the stuff that we've hit so far. It's so short and so hard that it's primarily going and working on the neuromuscular side of things. So the ability of the neurons to control the muscles. So if we just go and look here, again, aerobic, by the time I get a couple in here, you're probably maxed out here at the very least, because it's trying to help you recover. But that's not the point of our drills. The point is we're totally maxed out here. And then I could even say plus a bit more here, because we're going to use these creatine phosphate stores and stored ATP to try to produce maximal power for about up to, you know, maybe 30 seconds, probably less than that, so maybe 10 to 20 seconds. The goal here is max power as much as I can, which is going to help increase potentially a little bit my fiber size, so I get a little bit larger muscle fibers, and I'm going to get a little bit more of my stores here of these two. So those get stressed, so therefore I, in response, store more as I recover. And then finally, I'm going to really begin to stress the neuromuscular, or NM, power. So better ability for the nerves to control and maximize power output from our legs. But again, think, this zone right here, very short-lived. This is the one where if I get into a lot of sprint finishes, I would want to work on this zone a lot. So there's kind of our breakdown here in terms of our training zones and how we actually produce ATP. I just want to add on one more thing here, which I'll do to the right. Well, if I can zoom out a little bit. Let's see, come on, zoom out. All right, let me add on one more column because I think it might be helpful to you. Let's talk about primary fuel sources for all these. So as we go and start off, let's add on a little time. Fuel. I'm going to assume that we're kind of into these drills and zones, not when we first start. When we first start, we start off with a lot of a carbohydrate being used because it's available and we can use it in both forms of our fuel systems, but primarily zone 1, fats, because we have plenty of O2, which means fats are much more available, so therefore we'll go and use it. Fats again for zone 2. Zone 3, we start, I would argue, to kind of get a mix between fats and carbohydrates. So more carbs being involved here. And that's because we're starting to kind of get to that point where we need to use some carbs for this non-O2 sourced fuel. And our aerobic is starting to get closer to the max where we need to start to become more efficient. Zone 4 is definitely one where we're going and primarily relying on carbohydrates instead of fat, so big carbs, small fats, because as we approach maximal aerobic ability, we need to make efficient use of the O2 we have, and carbohydrates are substantially more efficient than a fat is. This is the same in zone 4C, so we're both like lumped right there. So when we hit zone 5, again, we are maxed out here, which means that we are carbohydrates, and that's true for the rest of these too. Carbs, again, are needed for any non-aerobic work because it's the only thing that we can burn without O2, or at least for our talk here, it is. And for our near maximal aerobic ability, it's because they're more efficient. So that's my kind of long talk here. Hopefully that kind of gives you some ideas of how what we just hit in terms of fuel systems powers what we actually do in terms of our training, and vice versa, how we should fuel for our training to go and stress certain forms of a fuel system. If you have a question, please feel free to ask either here in the comments or in practice. See ya.